Hello everyone, welcome back to the series of AWS Interview Question. In this video, we will discuss one of the most interesting AWS question which is generally asked in the interviews. Many interviewers ask, if we already have Assume role, then why do we need resource-based policies? This confusion is very common even among experienced software developers. In this video, we will clearly answer what Assume role really does, what resource-based policies do differently, when to use which policy, and we will give perfect interview-ready answer. Now let's clearly understand the interview question. The interview question is all about identity-based policy and resource-based policy. Why S3 bucket policy works without assume role? Or interviewer may also ask like, why do we need resource-based policies when STS assume role already exists? In simple words, if we can use STS assume role for cross-account access, why do AWS services like S3 and Lambda supports resource-based policies? Here, the interviewer wants to know, do you know where the policy is attached and how access is evaluated? Now, let's understand the core concept behind it. In AWS, access is controlled using policies. Policies means who can do what and on which resources. There are two important types involved here, identity-based access and resource-based access. In identity-based access, permissions are attached to the IAM identity like user or role. In resource-based access, permissions are attached directly to the AWS. At high level, AWS permissions can be identity-centric or resource-centric. Assume role belongs to the identity-based access, while services like S3 and Lambda also support resource-based access. Now let's look into assume role and resource-based policy. The core difference lies in where the permission is defined. With assume role, permissions are attached to the IAM role and an identity assumes that role using AWS STS. With resource-based policy, the permission is attached directly to the AWS resource and resource decide who can access it. Now what is assume role? Assume role is part of AWS STS security token service. When assume role is used, one identity assumes another role. AWS issues temporary credentials. Permission comes from role's identity-based policy and access is granted using the role. Point to note here is, assume role is an identity-based, session-based policy. Identity-based policy never knows who is accessing the resource from outside. It only defines what the identity is allowed to do. Now comes the resource-based policy. A resource-based policy is attached directly to the AWS resource, such as S3 bucket, Lambda function, SQS, or SNS. In this case, resource itself defines who can access it. No role is assumed, not even temporary credentials are generated. Important point to note here is resource-based policies are resource-centric and direct access. Resource-based policies explicitly mention the principle. They allow cross-account access without assume role. The key difference here is identity-based policy answers what can this identity do, while the resource-based policy answers who can access this resource. Now comes the most important question, why resource-based policy exists? If assume role already works, why did AWS introduce resource-based policies? The answer is simplicity and optimization. Not every access pattern requires role assumption, temporary credentials, or STS calls. For services that supports it, resource-based policies reduce complexity and make architecture cleaner. Both approach works, but AWS prefers simpler model when service supports resource-based policies. AWS introduced resource-based policies to simplify access models where role assumption is unnecessary, especially for cross-account and event-driven architecture. Now let's understand this using a real-world example. Here, account A needs to access an S3 bucket which is present in account B. There are two options. The first one is using assume role. So how it works? In account B, we create an IAM role. In the roles trust policy, we allow account A to assume this particular role. We attach permission policy to the role defining what resources it can access. Then, from account a user or service calls STS assume role. AWS returns temporary credentials like access key, secret key, session token, which is valid only for limited period of time. These credentials are then used to access resources in account B. This approach is powerful, but it involves identity switching and additional steps. Assume role is ideal when you need session control, MFA, and temporary access. We have another option 2, which is using resource based policy. So, how it works? We attach bucket policy to the S3 and allow account A as principal. AWS recommends this when service supports resource based policy. Here, the resource itself defines who can access it. Account A directly access resource in account B because resource based policy explicitly allows it. So there is no role assumption, no STS call, no temporary credentials. Now let's understand this using a diagram. We have a lambda function as part of account A and S3 bucket is present in account B. Now, how this access works? We create an IAM role in account B. This role has permission policy allowing access to S3. Now comes the important part, the trust policy. The trust policy answers account A is allowed to assume this role. Lambda in account A calls STS AssumeRole. STS then return temporary credentials such as access key, secret key, session token, which is only valid for a limited period of time. Using these credentials, Lambda in account A can access resources in account B. Now let's look at how resource-based policy flow works. An application in account A directly access an S3 bucket which is present in account B. The bucket policy explicitly allow account A as principal. There is no role assumption, no STS, no temporary credentials. The resource itself controls the trust. This model is simpler, preferred when services support resource-based policies. Now let me give you the perfect interview-ready answer. Assume role is used when access must happen as an identity with temporary credentials and session control. Resource-based policies are used when AWS services support direct trust, which allows simpler and more efficient access without role assumption. Resource-based policies reduce complexity while assume role provides stronger identity control. Now let's look at the follow-up questions which are generally asked in the interview. Can resource-based policies replace assume role? The answer is no. Only AWS services that support resource-based policies can use them. Not all the services. Which AWS services supports resource-based policies? S3, Lambda, SNS, SQS, and Event Bridge. When assume role is mandatory, when temporary credentials, MFA, session control is required, or when service does not support resource-based policies. Can Lambda use both models? The answer is yes. Invocations uses resource-based policies. Accessing other services uses IAM roles. Which approach does AWS recommend? Resource-based policies when supported, otherwise assume role. Point to note here is AWS did not create resource-based policies to replace assume role. They exist to reduce complexity, improve architecture clarity, optimize security models. Both policy exist because different access pattern require different security models. If you understand when to use which policy, you have mastered one of the most important AWS security concept. If you are preparing for AWS or cloud interviews, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more real-world AWS interview questions. In the next video, we will discuss another AWS question which most of the backend engineers get wrong.